Hello and welcome to the latest in our webinar series where we explore market trends and evolutions of risk concepts through the joys of the webinar. Today we're going to step into the world of fintech. To do so, we're going to hear about the role of a risk manager at a global fintech, and we're going to dissect some of the challenges faced when change is really the only constant and when risk management is dynamic in every sense. For some time now, fintechs have become a growing part of the financial services industry, disrupting incumbents and providing smarter ways of supporting traditional processes. So today, very much looking forward to hearing a little bit more about this journey. So just to take you through the agenda for today's session, I'm briefly going to introduce our speaker today. Today we're partnering with our friends at Zeps, who will be supported by Craig Wordsworth, who's going to take you through the main concept today, which is risk challenges facing fintechs in 2022. Throughout the session, I very much encourage you to ask questions. We're going to do a poll at the end where we'll gauge your level of risk maturity and perhaps some insights after the session. We'll break for some moderator questions where I'll take some time to posit a few questions and deep dive into a couple of the areas discussed in Craig's session. And then we'll spend some time at the end for your audience questions. So as I said, keen to get you engaged as much as possible, and anything that takes your interest or you're keen to understand more about, please reach out. So just to introduce the presenters today, my name is Gary Lineman. I'm the Director of Advisory for the Protect Group. Joined Protecht 3 years ago. My background is in financial services, and I lead the advisory practice at Protecht. Joined today by Craig Wordsworth, who is the Senior Manager for Enterprise Risk at World Remit. Craig is a risk management professional with a background again in financial services with over 10 years experience in Big Four consulting and other fintech enterprises. Next slide, Craig. Thanks. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we go. Consistent with previous sessions, please posit your questions in the question panel. No need to wait for the end. If you have a question, please pose it as and when you have it. Any questions we don't address towards the end of the session, sometimes we get lots of questions, we will follow up with you afterwards, and Craig and myself will make sure that we address those questions. And just with regards to the content today, the PDF will be made available after the session, and there'll also be a short survey that we will ask you to fill out upon conclusion of the session. Slide, Craig. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our key presenter today, Craig Wordsworth, and Craig's going to take you through the life of a risk manager at a fintech and some of the topics he sees as front of mind in his role. Hello, Craig, and welcome.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for the introduction as well. I'm very happy to be here. So today, like Gary said, the purpose of the call is really to go through some of the risk challenges that I've seen that are happening in this year and the coming years as well. And we'll talk through some of the insights and some takeaways that hopefully you can apply to your own organization too. So without further ado, we do have 25 minutes. We've got a lot of content to cover. So we'll hopefully have a few minutes at the end for any questions that you do have as well. So Gary has already introduced me. My name's Craig. I currently work for Zeps Group, not Zepsy, Zeps. They're the holding company for two key brands. So one of those being World Remit and the other one being Sendwave. And we're in the business of money remittance. So that's cross-border payments. So we move billions of dollars of people's money across borders, so country to country every year. And both of these brands do that. So I formerly started at World Remit They were founded in 2010. We send money across 70 different currencies, across 130 different corridors, 130 different countries with multiple corridors. And we've got lots of different ways that we send money. So it's either digital or physical, so there could be cash pickup as well. We acquired a company called Sendwave in 2021, and they're a little bit different. They still do payment services similar to WorldRemit, but they're a mobile first and they're 100% digital cross-border payments, and they focus on remittance to East and West Africa as well as Asia. So that's a little bit about the company that I work for, Zeps being the holding company for both WorldRemit and Sendwave. And now we'll get stuck into a little bit about the fintech space. So as Gary mentioned, we want to talk a little bit about what are the key risk challenges that we're seeing in fintech at the moment. And you're probably well aware of the growth story of fintechs and how much growth we've seen in the last 10 years. And with that growth operating at such a high pace, that just means that you're inherently going to have a lot more operational and strategic risk within a business environment that is operating at such a fast pace. So before I get stuck into that, a little bit about fintech. So fintech is financial technology, as the name kind of alludes to. It's made up of a range of different interesting companies or subcategories of fintech, and that could be around payments and remittance, which is what Zeps is. It could be around insurance technology or insurtech, regtech, and a few others there that I've got listed on that chart. The quants on that chart just show the number of deals that occurred in the UK in 2021 across the different categories of fintech there. So you can see how large each of those are. And we saw record numbers of investment in 2021. So we saw $11.6 billion of investment just in the UK. And this made up nearly half of all of Europe. So there's a lot of money flowing into these fintech firms. And we see that London is the hub of fintech in the UK, with over 2,500 fintechs basing themselves here. And it is the second globally in terms of the biggest hub, and that's second to San Francisco. So a little bit more about the fintech growth story. What we've seen is 16% year-on-year growth in the fintech space, and that's a huge number, and that's really in comparison to the likes of 1.3% growth in other SME organizations, and that's over the past 10 years. But we have started to see that a little bit of a pullback or slowdown in this space as well. And that was really kicked off in Q4 of 2021. And we've seen that come through into 2022 as well. So there's been a little bit of a shift in numbers of investment and deals that are going ahead. And what that means for fintechs, it could mean a little bit of a rethinking of strategy and long-term growth as well, and maybe a little bit more of prioritization of profitability rather than short-term growth. So that's a really interesting point to consider. But while we are in this hyper growth stage and while we have so much competition in fintechs, this just means that the pace that they're running at as an organization is extreme. So that just brings on inherent risks that a lot of other organizations not running at this pace experiences. Well, they experience it, but not to the extent that fintechs do. So one of those risks is around change risk. And some of the challenges here is about the high frequency and the number and speed of changes that are getting pushed through these organizations. And sometimes if you don't have appropriate governance and frameworks in place to deal with these changes, then different teams can cause bottlenecks in the approvals and pushing these changes through to completion. And the second challenge there that I've called out is around the lack of oversight. So a lot of companies that I've seen might not have the right level of oversight from second line functions and risk functions when these decisions are being made. And ultimately that leads to downstream impacts happening. So two key takeaways or insights that I've got here around change risk is about thinking about how you can build risk assessment and different risk elements into the thinking and the processes around business change. So risk really needs to be a part of BAU decision making. And what this does is it also allows an improvement in risk culture as well, not just about change management. And secondly, ensure that you do have appropriate governance and oversight where there are critical decisions being made in the organization. And what this does is it really allows that the right people can get involved at the right time to make those right decisions. If changes are being made in silos or in isolation and in quick succession, then often mistakes happen and the wrong decisions are made that aren't beneficial for the business long term. The second risk that I've got there is around scalability risk. So the two challenges that I've got is around, firstly, the manual nature of controls and processes that you see in a lot of these businesses. And what that means is if there's a lot of manual natured controls and processes, that's a lot of time and effort that's required by the business to make sure that they're operating effectively. And as the business grows and everything gets more busy, this also takes up a lot more time for people to be able to operate these controls. And then secondly, it's all about your technology stack. Fintechs, they're all about technology. So making sure that you have an agile tech stack, and when you are onboarding new systems and you're building that tech stack out, you need to make sure that it continues to be flexible and it allows growth, and it supports spikes in numbers of transactions and number of customers that you're onboarding as well. And it also allows you to expand into new initiatives and new product launches that you want to do in the future. And the last risk that I've got there is just around customer engagement. And I think this is a really critical one. It's all about engaging your existing customer base. So given that there is so much growth and competition in this space and that everyone is competing to win market share, you still need to not forget about your existing customer base. And it's not focusing on just getting new customers in the door. If you're not retaining those existing customers, or you're losing MTU or monthly transacting users, this ultimately results in weaker results, which impact the bottom line. So that's a really important part of it. And ensuring that you're able to scale your customer support services as well. So as you onboard lots more customers and you evolve and you go on your growth journey, you need to be able to support those customers to ensure that they do feel engaged, and where they have questions or queries or even complaints, that they're handled in a really efficient way as well. So two key takeaways here around customer engagement. So KRIs or key performance indicators. So KRIs are key risk indicators, KPIs are key performance indicators. Both of them are quantifiable metrics, and having good risk metrics or performance metrics in place allow you to really monitor the level of customer engagement that you're having. And it could be a really good warning indicator to where you might be dropping the ball. So making sure that you have a really good set of metrics that you can monitor against. And then secondly, this one is all about making sure that the customer impact is included in all levels of risk assessment. So whether or not that's doing your RCSAs across the business and assessing impact on the customer, or whether or not a risk event has happened or an incident has happened and you need to determine what impact that had, or whether or not it's a critical business decision and you need to determine what the downstream impact on the customer is, all of these elements that impact your customer should be front of mind. So those were the key elements that I called out in terms of the inherent risks of operating at such a fast pace. But fintechs, they're really on a global playing field, and what that means is they're competing in a complex multi-jurisdictional environment. So what does this environment look like? This slide I pulled together, and it gives you a really good snapshot of specifically the subcategory of cross-border payments within the fintech landscape. So on the left-hand side, you can see the top 100 cross-border payments firms, and you can see there that I've highlighted Zeps there in one of those 100. And on the right-hand side, you can see I've put a global map there, and I've called out a few of our key regulators that are relevant to the Zeps group and that we manage on a day-to-day basis. And what this really shows is it shows that you have a very competitive landscape and you have a very complex regulatory framework and environment to maintain compliance with as well. And what that does, it means that there's a lot of challenge in staying compliant and while you're competing against all of these other companies. And what that brings is it brings a lot of complexity and challenge to this space. So two of the key call outs here are the fact that if you're operating across more borders, that means more regulation for a fintech. So serving customers across multiple jurisdictions, more compliance, more management of obligations and reporting as well. And that could be across your licensing, your anti-money laundering program, financial crime, sanctions, data privacy, the list kind of goes on. And so some of the key call outs or takeaways in this space is really about making sure that you have a really robust process for managing your regulatory obligations, that you have a single location and that you have that consistent approach. And that's really important to making sure that you have completeness and accuracy across all of your reg obligations, so nothing is getting missed. And then secondly, and I think this is a really important point, it's probably, I've got my auditor hat on here, being able to evidence that you are compliant with these regulatory obligations as well. Just putting your finger in the wind and saying, yeah, we are compliant doesn't really cut it anymore. So being able to show or evidence that you are compliant is very important, whether it's to an auditor or a regulator, or maybe one of your banking partners or investors wants to see your level of compliance. You need to be able to show this. And one of the ways that you can do that is actually linking it back to your control environment, because it's a really robust and mature way of actually showing your level of compliance by linking it back to your key controls. The second risk challenge that I've got here is about managing regulatory change. And this landscape is full of changes, and there's new regulation and changes to existing regulation happening all the time. And if you don't have a proactive way of managing this, then it often leads to really reactive measures being put in place and weak controls. And that can often lead to a state of non-compliance for a period of time as well. Now, getting this data isn't exactly easy. It's quite a hard task. And staying across all of the changes when you have such a wide regulatory environment, it is very difficult. So I've got a few takeaways here that could help with this approach. So firstly, obviously being proactive is key. You need to be forward looking. You need to have a horizon scanning mentality, because being reactive is just inadequate, and it'll really catch you off guard. Secondly, think about how you can utilize your skilled resources in the business. So you've got subject matter experts. So I guess you essentially have horizon scanners already within the business. But you can also utilize third-party tools and internal software that you already have to help you on this journey as well. There's plenty of third parties that can provide this service for you. And then lastly, where you do identify that there are changes that could impact the business, it's really important to see these all the way through to completion. So it's not just about identifying the change, it's about assessing the level of impact to the business, and it's also about managing it through to closure. So that might be about putting some actions in place and making sure that they have accountable owners and due dates on them. Now on the right hand side, this is really just a snapshot that I pulled together just to show the fact that the FCA, which is the Financial Conduct Authority, the main regulator, financial regulator in the UK, this is just showing that they are taking a hard stance on this, and we've seen record number of fines given out in 2021, nearly just over $500 million there. And you can see I've kind of categorized the level of fines that they handed out, and you can see that anti-money laundering and the prevention and controls around AML was the most significant level or category where they handed out fines, but you can see a few other areas there. But in summary, that's all in relation to having weak control and risk frameworks in place. So the third point that I want to make is around preparing for disruption. Now, we're all aware about how much disruption has been happening recently or over the last few years, and it's not going to go away. It's more or less going to become more of the norm. So it's all about making sure that you have a resilient and agile fintech to be able to navigate the storms and make it through, and to be able to continue competing. So one of the risk challenges that I've called out here is about fintechs having a global footprint, and that just means having more global exposure and therefore having exposure to external events and threats. We've seen climate, geopolitical risk, ESG, so environment, social governance, they're all becoming more and more significant operational and strategic risk areas for fintechs. So even just, the last few years, we saw Typhoon Odette hit the Philippines, we saw COVID-19, we've seen the Ukraine and Russia war kick off, and all of these events have had significant disruption impacts to businesses across the globe. And so building a resilient business is super crucial. We don't know what's around the corner, but just making sure that the business is prepared for what's up next is really critical in limiting the disruption that it has to both operations and to your customers as well. So a few key takeaways that I have here. The first dot point that I've got there is about regularly assessing. And what I mean by that is it's really a proactive measure, and it allows you to get a temperature check on what could impact you and where it could impact you and what's the significance of that impact as well. So this is really important about assessing external events that could happen on the horizon. And I've got a little snippet there on the right-hand side, and this is a snippet of a climate risk assessment that my team has done recently. And this just goes to show what it is. It's an overlay of the global map. We've got the climate risk index by country and by color. So you can see the redder the country, the higher the risk for climate risk events to occur. And we've overlaid that with where our teams sit across the globe. So you can see we have a very widespread global workforce. And really what this allows us to do is to understand where our teams are based and what is the impact that could happen to those teams if these events continue to occur. And it allows us to put contingency plans in place and make workarounds and really just understand the level of risk that we're taking on by having teams situated in these countries. The second dot point that I've got as the key takeaway is designing resilience into BAU. And what I mean by that is really when you're building out your processes and controls, really consider about building resilience, backups, workarounds into the design from the start. And one way that World Remit and Zeps has looked at doing this is we're a payments network. We have a global payments network, and that's critical for running our business. So where we do have critical payout partners and correspondents, these are critical for our business continuing and operating for our customers. So we see the importance of this, and we have contingency backup partners for each of these critical payout partners as well. So if we do experience disruption to any of them, we can easily switch over to other partners and banking institutions as well. And then the last takeaway that I have here is about learning. So learning from past events. So it's about performing deep dive reviews and really understanding what went wrong and how you can do better from these events when they happen. So you can understand what went well, how we can do better, and really look at implementing an action plan afterwards to make sure that you fix any gaps in your resilience framework. And extending on disruption, another key area of disruption is around third parties, third and fourth parties. And the key challenge here is about minimizing the impact of disruption that critical third parties have on fintechs. And it's no surprise that fintechs and many other companies, they're prone to outsourcing a lot of their critical services and functions. And what this means is it means a heightened level of risk in this. There's a mentality, with that mentality, it can lead to sometimes an over-reliance on certain third parties for performing these critical activities. And even if you just look back in 2021, on the right-hand side of this slide, I've called out a couple of key disruptions or key outages from some of the big players that we saw impacts to other businesses in. And in 2021, we saw outages across Microsoft Azure, the Facebook network, AWS, and even just looking back, I clearly remember when Facebook went down. it was down for about 7 hours, and it wasn't just Facebook, it was the whole Facebook group. It wasn't called Meta at the time, they were still Facebook, but it took out WhatsApp, Instagram, all of their components that make up their group. And you wouldn't necessarily think that a social media firm would have such a big impact on other businesses. But when you think about it, if your customer support channel is through using WhatsApp and that goes down for 7 hours, then you've just lost that communication channel between your business and your customer for 7 hours. So it can have a really, really critical impact to a lot of businesses. So a couple of key takeaways here and insights in relation to minimizing impact from your third parties. So the first one there is about regularly assessing. So not just at the time of onboarding new vendors, it's all about continual assessment and monitoring of vendors. You know, the risk profile of these vendors changes all the time. So if you're just assessing them at the time of onboarding, then you've kind of just filed them away and you've kind of forgotten about them. And you're oblivious then to the risk that they pose to the business. And there's lots of third-party tools that help you to deliver this. We use a third party to help with the monitoring of all of our critical third parties. And this is a really good tool for alerting us to where there might be a higher risk that we're experiencing with these third parties that we might need to look into further or seek further clarification from them on. The second point is around the fact that, and this is probably quite obvious to everyone on the call, but you can never outsource risk. And I think this is one of the first things that I learned as a risk professional. And if you are a third party and disruption occurs, this will impact all of the vendors that rely on that third party. And it will impact your customers as well. So just making sure that there isn't any that this is front of mind. Even though you're outsourcing your critical services, you're still retaining the risk. The third point there is about over-reliance. And like I mentioned, if you are outsourcing a lot of your critical processes, you may be exposed to over-reliance on critical third parties. And it's almost like having a key person risk in a business, but it's a third party. So just making sure that you have proper contingency plans in place if you do experience an outage from them. And then the last point there is, and I think this is one of the most critical points, is if disruption does occur, it's super important that you do have an open communication channel with your customers. So don't leave them in the dark. And this just goes back to my first point about making sure that you're engaging with your customer base. So given that there's the potential for all of this future disruption, this part is now about risk exposure management, and it's about managing your issues and being able to tell the right story at the right time to get that right outcome. So the first point here is about staying on top of your issues. So it's quite obvious, but unresolved issues will lead to increased risk events occurring. You know, if you've got gaps in your control and risk environment and they're not being resolved, then this just leaves the door open to things to go wrong. And the second point that I want to make is the breadth of issue management and having an issue management framework is actually quite broad. And not all companies do it at all or do it well. So really just thinking about what is the full breadth and extent of all of the issues that can happen within your business, and just making sure that you have a way of managing all of those in the right way. So I guess that's leading into my takeaways or insight. It's just about making sure that you have a single source of truth for managing your issues and reporting on them. And this really just makes sure that you're not overlooking any of those issues, that they're all handled in a consistent way, and you're resolving them in a timely manner. And the second point there is it's about the risk team. So the risk team plays a really crucial part in issue management across the business. I think the risk function is one of those only teams that has oversight across all areas of the business. So they play a really important role. And I think they can add a lot of value in terms of issue management and providing a benefit for the first line. And so the second line really needs to make sure that they're challenging and providing guidance and oversight on all of the issues, and especially the remediation actions that are putting in place. Just because there are actions to resolve an issue doesn't mean it will resolve it for the long term. So providing that risk lens will really give that long-term thinking in terms of closing out your issues. And the second point there is about prioritization. Everyone is super busy at the moment, and there's only limited capacity, so you can't do everything at once. So if prioritization, if issues aren't prioritized, then critical things might not get the right attention at the right time. And I've seen this at lots of different companies. So a couple of key takeaways there. One being, if you prioritize based on the risk to the business, then that will give you a good structure for what to deal with first. And then that way you can also ensure that you have clear accountability, and you can set timeframes as well for when you need to close out your actions in relation to issues. But also the second point there is making sure that you do get the right level of visibility and you get the right level of sponsorship from your executive team in terms of the action plans and the roadmaps to resolve these issues as well. If you don't have the right buy-in, then a lot of these plans will just fall over, or they'll get deprioritized later on. And I think World Remit is actually really good at doing this in terms of our committees, our governance committees that we have in place. We've got a risk management committee, an equivalent financial crime and compliance committee. And both of those run on a fortnightly cycle, and those committees have a lot of oversight and visibility, and they push forward a lot of these issues and other elements of the risk framework. So they're a really good oversight body, and we escalate up through our other governance committees if required there. The second point that I wanted to make here is around the changing risk profile of fintechs. So risk acceptance and choosing the right treatment is really critical. And if the appropriate treatment isn't taken at the right time, and therefore effort and money isn't well spent. It's not about just reducing risk all the time. It's just about making sure that you're making the right judgment call at the end of the day about how you want to treat it going forward. And if fintechs want to enable long-term and sustainable growth, then they really need to consider how much they invest into their control frameworks and risk frameworks, and not just spend their next dollar on short-term growth initiatives as well. So a couple of key takeaways here that will really help in this space is, firstly, being able to quantify and communicate and analyze the benefits of reducing risks further, rather than just jumping into a mitigation strategy. You need to be able to understand what a mitigation strategy will actually, how that will benefit the business long term. And then you need to be able to communicate that to the senior management within the firm as well. The second point is about acceptance of risk, and you shouldn't automatically just be avoiding acceptance of risk. Often this is actually the best outcome or the best way to treat risk. So it shouldn't automatically be avoided. It needs to be considered carefully. But this then goes into the second point, that if you do want to accept risk, then you need to have a robust acceptance process or framework in place. And that would be around making sure that this is reviewed and it's approved and it continues to be monitored. Otherwise, it could just open the floodgates for a lot of people just to accept risk without considering the consequences of doing that. And you need to also make sure that it is aligned as best as possible to your risk appetite statements as well. I think World Remit does a really good job at this in terms of its risk acceptance process. We do have a way of monitoring where we do risk accept, and we have specific KRIs or key risk indicators that are mandatory where we do accept risk, and that allows us to continue to monitor and make sure that risk profile isn't changing after we have accepted it. So it's really important to not just file it away and forget about it once it has been accepted, and continue to monitor. And the last point here is about investing in controls to enable sustainable growth. And I think this is the strongest point that I've got to make. The visual on the right-hand side, we've pulled this together to try and visualize what we're talking about here. But this is really to demonstrate that investment in controls really enables scalability and a reduction in costs around operational, customer, and financial elements. And what that does over long term, it enables more headroom for growth initiatives to take flight. So rather than spending all of your money on short-term growth campaigns, if you spend it in investment in controls, then over the long run, you'll see more scalability and a long-term cost reduction within the business as well. So that's a really critical point. So my last challenge area, or risk challenge area, is about the changing risk capability. And how the risk team and the risk function is changing over time, and what the required skills are to add value to the business. So this one is about the role of the risk function and moving the needle. So scaling the risk function in line with the size and maturity of the business is probably the most critical point here. So ensuring that you have the right size team and you have the internal capabilities within the function. Otherwise, you won't see the value add that a lot of other companies do see where they get it right. A couple of key takeaways here are, the first one is making sure that the second team or the second line teams need to be right sized for the organization based on the maturity of the business, but also the maturity of the framework. Without sufficient resourcing at the right time and having the skills and capability in the second line just means that the framework won't be successful or as successful as hoped or as you're planning to make it. So getting the foundations right is super critical, making sure you have the right size team to get the foundations in first, and then you can scale the risk function in line with the growth of the business. The second point there is the really, really important role that risk champions play within the business. So I see risk champions as a 1.5 line. So I guess they don't sit as purely first line because they don't own a lot of the risk and they're not in the second line, but they support both of them. So really making sure that the risk champions are designated across the business, they're communicated, people are aware of them, and they play a really pivotal role in making sure that the risk framework is rolled out successfully and that both first and second line are supported. The third point there is making sure that you have a balanced skill set within the team. You know, I've seen a lot of businesses where they have a really technical skill set or technical capabilities within the second line function. And sometimes that works, but often it doesn't. You really need to have that balanced skill set, and you really need to make sure that it's aligned to the risk profile of the business. And I guess one example there is, you know, with World Remit, we do have, you know, third party risk, and it's a key risk within our taxonomy. And we acknowledge this, and we have a dedicated senior manager for third-party risk within the risk function. So this just goes to show that you need the right skill set and experience in order to support from a second line perspective. A couple of other points is the second line really needs to be the influencer within the business. So they need to be able to communicate effectively within the first line, but also at senior management level. And there's also been a greater focus on technology, product, and innovation within the fintech space as well. So you really need to consider how the second line can be embedded in that. And then my last point is about being able to aggregate all components within the risk framework to tell the right story. And I think Protecht actually does this really well with their risk in motion dashboards that they have. It kind of aligns all of the elements of a standard risk framework, and it kind of just shows how you're performing against risk appetite and where you might have gaps or improvement opportunities as well. So this is a really good story to tell. And this slide is really about enterprise risk management at World Remit. So the benefits of having an integrated ERM solution is really important. So Excel simply doesn't cut it anymore for managing data relating to your risk management framework. And it's really critical to piece together all of your elements, like I was just saying, to tell the whole story. And this can be achieved by having a GRC tool in place. And some of those benefits are around automation. So removing that admin burden on the risk team, whether it's email follow-ups or notifications and managing spreadsheets. This really just frees up a lot of that admin time, and that time can be redirected for more value add within the business. The second point is about better dashboards and reporting. You can connect all of the elements within your framework in a GRC tool, and that enables you to tell the whole story and have much better reporting and go towards having live reporting as well, rather than quarterly or monthly. And then having it all as a single source of truth. So really just breaking down those silos of information, removing the spreadsheets, making it accessible to the business, and then being able to rely on the information that is in your tool. So just to wrap up, a couple of the key takeaways here. Fintechs, we're operating at lightning speed, and there's inherent risks of operating at such high pace. You know, one of the key takeaways was to think about how you integrate risk into business change processes so that you're not making mistakes before the change even goes through. The second point that I made was around the complexity of the global regulatory environment. And the key takeaway here is about maintaining a single source of truth for your obligations and making sure that you have a robust framework in place to manage this. The third point was around preparing for disruption. You know, disruption is becoming more and more BAU. So understanding and managing the level of risk exposure that your critical third parties and even fourth parties have on your business. Fourth point was around issue management and risk acceptance, and how it's super important to make sure that you're investing in risk reduction and your control environment. And over time, that actually allows you and supports you to further future growth initiatives as well. And the last point that I made there was about scaling your risk capability. So making sure that you have a balanced skill set in the risk function, and that needs to be aligned to the risk profile of the business. So hopefully that was quite insightful. That was a lot of information to take in, but hopefully you can take away a few things from that. Over to you, Gary.
Great. Thank you very much for that. First of all, I thought that was a fantastic presentation and tremendous insights in so many areas. I think we're going to go back and touch on some of those areas with a couple of questions shortly after the poll. But I guess maybe two kind of takeaways from me was, in particular, the external event outlook and how you're kind of looking at that global footprint from a climate risk perspective and identification of hotspots. I think that's particularly interesting. And also, I think the linkage between corporate and social, and I know you alluded to some of the high-profile socials such as Meta, etc. I think becoming more and more interested in how intertwined they are in everyday business process. But yeah, tremendous stuff. We're going to move on to a quick poll just to set the scene before we dive into a few more questions. And Simon's going to open up the poll for us now. And the poll is there in front of you. We're going to give you about 30 seconds to respond to the poll. So the question is, how does your organization currently manage risk and compliance? And we've got a couple of options outlined. I'll just pause for a couple of seconds. Give it 10 more seconds. Okay, Simon, if we can close the poll. All right, fascinating insight into the poll. So 55% still using spreadsheets to manage their risk management requirements, which I think is extremely interesting, just given some of the areas that Craig talked about today and the fast pace, and I think Craig alluded to it as lightning speed. So I think we will keep in mind some of these the background for the audience when we go through some of these questions. But Craig, maybe just to touch on some of the areas that we've just been through, and again, for the audience, encourage you to keep the questions coming into the chat. But just coming back to the lightning speed section, what change risk methodology do you adopt at Zeps, and how does that complement or integrate the business change process and the speed at which they want to incorporate change?
Just make sure I go off mute. Really good question. So in terms of change methodology, one of the things that we've implemented recently at Zeps, or specifically for World Remit, is a new initiatives committee. So this is really to give a much better governance framework around critical business changes. So two key elements of the new initiatives committee is called a NIC, and we've had a lot of good take up by the business as well. So what we do is we have a risk questionnaire in there. So this is really to flag where there might be downstream impacts or risks from any of the new initiatives or changes that come through that committee. And the other really good feature of it is it gives key people across the business visibility of those changes, and it allows them to give input and have oversight of them before they happen. And prior to this committee, we saw that a lot of changes were happening in isolation, and they didn't have the right level of second line input or even first line feedback before they went through. So it's really valuable to have these types of change governance frameworks in place.
Yeah. And I guess gives you the visibility then to kind of move forward with the change, knowing what delivered risk is about to be transitioned into an operational risk.
Exactly right. Yep.
Fantastic. Just maybe to touch on the global playing field section, such an impressive expansion plan from Zeps over the recent years, but how much of an important role does the standardization and the consistency of the enterprise risk team's approach to management of regulations play for an organization with that global footprint, noting the plethora of regulators you have to appease? Is consistency and standardization a key focus?
Yeah, I think in everything that we do with the risk management framework, consistency and standardization is a focus now, because if you're not doing that, then you're opening yourself up to mistakes and people doing things in isolation and doing it in an ad hoc way. So I think regulatory obligations are one way that we're looking to tackle that. And this is a big challenge for all fintechs, and World Remit and Zeps, like other fintechs, aren't perfect at this, but everyone is on a journey to make sure that we're in a more compliant state. But making sure that it is done consistently is super critical, and making sure that it's done in an efficient way, because you only have limited capacity within the teams to deal with this stuff. So making sure that it's done as efficiently as possible is really critical, but just also making sure that you're ticking all of the necessary boxes as well, that you're not overlooking any main parts for your regulations, and making sure that it's in a single place. So you don't have to go navigating for it in different spreadsheets and whatnot. So yeah, I think consistency and standardization for regulatory obligations is really important.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Perhaps one around disruption. So very much the topic of the day. I suppose I'm referring to the regulators' focus on operation resilience at the moment, but perhaps a question more on continuous improvement. So let's assume disruption is a norm. I'm interested, does Zeps or World Remit, do you look to adopt a program or a process of continuous improvement that you're learning from these events, and then kind of assessing internally your readiness should similar events occur in future?
Yeah, we are. We're looking to improve in all elements of the business, right? And hopefully other fintechs are doing the same. You can't be standing still for too long, otherwise you'll get swamped and you'll fall behind. So I guess a couple of things that come to mind in terms of regular improvement or continuous improvement is around our action management, and this is really important. So we use the Protecht system, and with all of our registers that we have and managing our data, we make sure that we align all of those registers to a centralized action register. And that's super critical for the risk team to oversee that everyone is delivering on their roadmaps and their remediation actions across the business, whether or not it's relating to an internal audit finding, a disruptive event, an outage, a control weakness, whatever it is, there should be an action plan in place to resolve any problems that we have. So I think that's a really critical element of continuous improvement. And also just the fact that one of my slides, I was talking about issue management as well. So funneling all of those different types of issues into a single way or standardized approach as well, I think that enables you to have continuous improvement. Because if you're not doing that, then things, issues might arise, but then they just get dropped off the radar and people forget about them, or they don't get prioritized. So there's a few different ways that you can kind of show that you are continuously improving, and I think we do that quite well at WorldRemit.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess the evidence of that is probably an enhanced risk maturity and risk awareness across the organization, which, that positive risk culture will lead to better business outcomes as well and commercial outcomes.
Definitely. Yep.
Just one around the risk exposure, and I guess an interesting area at the moment is third parties, right, and outsourcing. For the audience today, do you have any kind of tips and tricks, or what do you see working well with regards to how you get comfort that your third parties or your vendors that you're engaging with, that they have effective control environments stood up and they're designed effectively and hopefully operating effectively as well? I suppose just at a high level, if you could touch on some of the things that you see at Zeps working well in that area.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I've experienced this at lots of different organizations, and this is a really tricky one as well, in terms of how you get comfort across your third parties and the level of risk exposure that you have, and to what extent that you seek assurance across those. A few ways that I've seen it done really well is you can really look to utilize external providers with this, or certifications and reports that are done on these third parties. And examples of those are like our SOC reporting. So SOC reports give a really insightful view on whether or not internal controls are designed and operating effectively with your third parties. And that can give you a really good level of assurance that they've got a well-defined, well-designed and operating environment. Or you could also have things like ISO 27001 certifications that you can request from these third parties as well. And that also gives you a level of assurance that they have a robust environment. I think, the fact that everyone is going remote and everyone's going digital, back in the day, as an internal auditor at Ernst & Young, a lot of the times you would be going out and you'd be doing inspections and reviewing physical racks and physical security around data warehouses and whatnot. But a lot of that is kind of moving away, and it's all going towards the cloud. So you need to think about how you're, what's the best tool that you have available to you to get comfort across your third parties.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the focus for time to come, I think, and that healthy tension between release of information versus use of internal audit, etc. along the way. It's be interesting to see how that plays out, and the regulator, I think, will have a role to play there as well.
Yeah, definitely.
One last one for me, Craig, before we move to the audience questions, was around the risk acceptance piece, which I found particularly interesting. Experience risk acceptance. There's always kind of had a stigma to it that to accept risk is almost to say it's okay, and it's we're brushing something away, or we're going to move forward regardless. And sometimes senior leaders will be more risk averse, and the idea of accepting a risk is quite foreign. I'm interested from a stakeholder management perspective, how they've sought to adopt this mindset of risk acceptance is okay because the business needs to accept risk in order to make money and take the opportunities that present themselves. So any insights there will be helpful.
Yeah, I think I think it's a really good question, and I feel like there definitely is a stigma around risk acceptance. It's often avoided at the front. At the forefront. So I think trying to change that attitude, and not all risk is bad, and for fintechs it's a critical part of growing. We need to take a certain level of risk to reap the reward in the long run. But I think what we need to do is make sure that we have appropriate guardrails in place to make sure that we're taking or accepting the right level of risk and making sure that it's aligned to our risk appetite, because essentially that's the overarching governing statute for taking risk in the business. So just making sure that it is aligned to that. But if you're doing it in the right way, then I think it's a very powerful tool for the exec team and for the rest of the organization as well. And it allows us to then prioritize what our teams focus on and what they spend their time and attention on. So yeah, I think it's a really critical tool, and I think there's a lot of stigma around it at the moment.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you for those. So just a couple, Craig, from the audience before we close out.
Yep.
How do you assist the business in measuring how long they spend on the undertaking of their control assurance? And if you had any tips in that regard?
Good question. How much time they spend in control assurance? I think it needs to be fit for purpose for the business, and I think the framework needs to be designed so that it aligns to the maturity of the business as well. You know, you don't want you don't want the first line spending loads of time working on control assurance if you're in the early stages of a startup.
Yep.
You need to be able to guide the first line to what level of assurance that they need to provide, whether or not that's a simple attestation or if that's you know, a lot of evidence and internal testing. But I think that's the role of the second line to ensure that they can hold the hand of the first line and make sure that they're not spending too much time on these activities, because you know, everyone has a day job. They've got BAU processes to handle as well. So just making sure that you're getting the right level aligned to the maturity.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that one. So, you know, many of our clients in Protecht, how they'll look to accommodate or solve for that issue is they will often differentiate the controls between key controls, so ones that are materially mitigating a risk event, versus compensating controls, which may be perceived to be the more high-level directional controls, such as policies, training, etc., that really put up the bowling alleys but don't necessarily mitigate operational risk on a day-to-day to the same degree as a key control might. So that's probably one way, is just different labels on the controls can often focus the business attention to a particular area. One final one, are you applying any sort of intelligent controls through data analytics or AI? And do you believe the industry is starting to think this way?
Yes, the industry is definitely starting to think that way. I think it's a really good question. It's definitely on the roadmap in terms of how we can make our KRIs and metrics more efficient and more intelligent. Protecht actually has an intelligent feature where it has intelligent KRIs basically, so you can apply algorithms or formulas to existing KRIs to interpret more of a smart KRI as well. But we are looking to integrate with other systems and use APIs to tell a more efficient story. So rather than necessarily having AI there, we want to have live data. So making sure that we have data not on a monthly basis, but anytime. So if you want to go in and see what's the current temperature for risk, then you can log in and see that. But yeah, I think definitely AI and machine learning is on the cards, but it really just depends on how mature your framework is.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, I think that rounds out the webbing today. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Craig, on behalf of Protecht, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope the audience, I hope you've got tremendous insights from the session. Please reach out to Craig or myself if you have any questions after the session. We'd be delighted to address those. But to all, I'm going to close the webinar now, but look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks a lot. Bye.